quickly. Settle down.
After the armistice, aircraft manufacturers around the world struggled to survive as the belligerents downsized their air forces. But in spite of a post-war recession and the Great Depression that followed, the 1920s and 30s became the golden age of flight. Pilots were among the most celebrated heroes of the day, and the public thrilled to excitement of air races and the feats of Jimmy Doolittle, Wiley Post, Amelia Earhart, and a shy 25-year-old former airmail pilot named Charles Lindbergh. The airmail service blazed the trail for commercial aviation from coast to coast after a decidedly uncertain start. In 1918, with World War I still raging in Europe, Congress appropriated $100,000 to establish experimental airmail routes.
In 1919, Eddie Hubbard and I took a flight up to Vancouver, BC. On our return trip, the postmaster at Vancouver handed us a mail sack for delivery to the postmaster at Seattle. This was the first international mail ever carried by plane into the United States.
The Post Office Department urged the Army Signal Corps to lend its planes and pilots until they could secure their own. Carrying the mail, the department argued, would provide invaluable cross-country experience to student flyers. The Secretary of War agreed. On May 15, 1918, the Post Office Department began scheduled airmail service between New York and Washington, D.C.
President Wilson and the First Lady addressed the letter to the postmaster of New York City. Witnesses watched the first airmail letter being posted. Lack of instruments and navigation maps made flying tough, but we hoped jobs like this would increase public confidence in our ability.
Simultaneous takeoffs were made from Washington's Polo Grounds and from Belmont Park, Long Island, both trips by way of Philadelphia. It was a task for which the Army pilots in their Curtiss Jennies were ill prepared. Chosen to fly the Washington to New York route was U.S. Army Air Service Lieutenant George Boyle. Boyle got an assignment because he was engaged to marry the daughter of a powerful man whom the post office wanted to impress. With the mail sacked up and ready to go, President Woodrow Wilson shook Boyle's hand and wished the young pilot luck. The 4 sacks were stashed away in the airplane's open cockpit as the pilot climbed aboard and taxied off to make the first official flight. Boyle had been told to follow the clearly visible railroad tracks north from Washington, D.C. to Philadelphia. But in a rather ignominious start to the service, he flew south instead and got hopelessly lost, crashing into a field less than 22 miles from Washington. Postal managers let him try again, but he went even further off course, flying almost out over the Atlantic Ocean 150 miles to the east. Luckily, the second pilot, traveling south from New York, was able to follow the rail lines without incident and delivered the first airmail. Boyle was retired in embarrassment. After this inauspicious start, the Army did a surprisingly successful job of flying the mail between New York and Washington. On August 12, 1918, the Post Office took over all phases of the airmail service, using newly hired civilian pilots and mechanics and 6 specially built mail planes from the Standard Aircraft Corporation. The U.S. airmail pilots were necessarily a tough bunch of men. Armed with pistols to protect the mail, they maintained regular flights over mountains and deserts in inadequate aircraft with primitive instruments. Pilots flew by dead reckoning or by the seat of their pants. Forced landings occurred frequently because of bad weather, but fatalities in those early months were rare, largely because of the small size, maneuverability, and slow landing speed of the planes. Because Congress had set airmail postage at a rather pricey 24 cents, the public was at first reluctant to use the service. During the first year, airmail bags contained as much regular mail as actual airmail. The department's long-range plans called for an eventual transcontinental air route from New York to San Francisco to better its delivery time on long hauls and to convince the stamp-buying public of the benefits of using airmail. The first legs of this transcontinental route, from New York to Cleveland with a stop at Bellefonte, Pennsylvania, and from Cleveland to Chicago with a stop at Bryan, Ohio, opened in 1919. A third leg opened the following year, Chicago to Omaha via Iowa City, with feeder lines to Chicago from St. Louis and Minneapolis. Finally, on September 8, 1920, the last transcontinental segment opened, from Omaha to San Francisco via North Platte, Cheyenne, Rollins, Rock Springs, Salt Lake City, Elko, and Reno. At this time, mail was still carried on trains at night and flown by day, but even so, the new service bettered cross-country all-rail time by 22 hours. To provide pilots with up-to-date weather information needed to fly the mail all the way from New York to San Francisco, the department began to install radio stations at each flying field in August 1920. By November, 10 stations were operating, including 2 Navy stations. When airmail traffic permitted, other government departments used the radios instead of the telegraph for special messages, and the Department of Agriculture transmitted weather forecasts and stock market reports over the radios. On February 22, 1921, mail was flown both day and night for the first time over the entire distance from San Francisco to New York. Jack Knight's Airmail Odyssey illustrates the determination of those early aerial pioneers. Knight was originally scheduled to fly just one leg of the first day and night transcontinental airmail trip. He began flying the mail eastward to Omaha well after dark. About midnight, near Kearney, Nebraska, he encountered snow. Landing at Omaha by the light of burning gasoline drums placed along the runway, Knight found that his relief pilot had not arrived. By this time, the snowfall had become a blizzard. After refueling his plane, Knight took off for Chicago at 2 a.m. with only a road map to guide him over terrain he had never crossed before. With deep snow preventing a landing at Des Moines, Knight put down at an emergency landing site at Iowa City, Iowa, using the light of railroad flares set out by the field's night watchman, the only person there at the time. Knight refueled and took off again, heading toward Lake Michigan, which would serve as a landmark to help him find Chicago. But when the snow stopped sometime before dawn, he encountered fog. It wasn't until daybreak, when the early rays of the sun burned off the fog, that Knight could be sure he was on course. He spotted Lake Michigan gleaming in the morning sun, and turning south, made his way to Chicago's checkerboard field, where he was greeted upon landing by a throng of people who had gathered to see if the daring young pilot would finish his remarkable flight. His mail was relayed on to Cleveland and then New York, finally arriving 33 hours and 20 minutes after leaving San Francisco. Jack Knight was a national hero. He saved the first continuous coast-to-coast airmail flight from certain failure, despite the fact that he had broken his nose a few days earlier in a plane crash. Congress was impressed. It appropriated $1.25 million for the expansion of airmail service, especially ground facilities, enabling the Post Office Department to install additional landing fields, towers, beacons, searchlights, and boundary markers across the country. It also equipped the planes with luminescent instruments, navigational lights, and parachute flares. In 1922 and 1923, the Post Office Department was awarded the Collier Trophy for important contributions to the development of aeronautics, especially its safety record, and for demonstrating the feasibility of night flying. In 1926, an airmail pilot received the first Harmon Trophy for advancing aviation. On February 2nd, 1925, Congress authorized the Postmaster General to hand over the mail routes to commercial aviation. The first commercial mail service flight in the United States took off on February 15, 1926. By the end of 1926, 11 out of 12 contracted airmail routes were up and flying. On April 13, 1926, a baby-faced former Army pilot and barnstormer from the Midwest was hired by one of the first private contractors to fly the mail between Chicago and St. Louis. His name was Charles Lindbergh. In September of 1926, he found himself trapped above a dense layer of fog outside of Chicago. Unable to land, he eventually ran out of fuel and had to bail out. Only 6 weeks later, Lindbergh again had to parachute to safety, this time after being caught in snow and low clouds. His fellow airmail pilots began to call him Lucky Lindy. Lindbergh's repeated crack-ups caught the attention of Aviation Administrator William P. McCracken, who commented, "He's not going to help commercial aviation if he keeps dropping these airplanes around the country." McCracken must have been relieved when Lindbergh quit airmail flying to take up another challenge. As commercial air carriers began to take over its routes, the Post Office Department transferred its lights, airways, and radio service to the Department of Commerce. Some planes were sold to airmail contractors, others were transferred to interested government departments. By September 1st, 1927, the Post Office Department was out of the aviation business, and commercial contractors carried all airmail. Airmail pilots had become folk heroes in the 20s. But the pilots who most captured the public's eye, and who probably did more to promote aviation than any others, were the barnstormers.
After the war was over, a great many of American boys had been taught to fly, but they didn't get to the front. Of course, after the war was over, they had nothing to do, and there were a great many surplus airplanes. And that is the period when you hear so much about of the days of barnstorming. After the war, with all these surplus airplanes, a lot of the fellows who had been taught to fly then decided to go out and carry passengers and do stunts and regular exhibition flying, principally at county fairs and state fairs and things of that sort.
They performed in special air shows or state fairs. Sometimes small groups of gypsy flyers would land in a field near a remote town and put on a show for tips and a meal. With $50 war surplus trainers and a complete disregard for the law of gravity, the barnstormers crisscrossed the country, thrilling crowds everywhere they went with their seemingly impossible aerobatics. There were no safety regulations, so the barnstormers tested the limits of their aircraft and the laws of gravity. Since audiences were not prepared to wait for the chance accident to liven up the event, the pilots staged spectacular crashes as part of the show. Wildcats like Howard Hawks, Roscoe Turner, and Edward Stinson deserve much credit for introducing America to the sky. The crowds loved to watch the daredevils outdo each other with spectacular stunts. The steady, easy-to-fly Jenny Standard Army trainer was the barnstormer's craft of choice. Roscoe Turner and his lion cub Gilmore may have been the most famous of these aerial daredevils. Flamboyant in his powder blue tunic, polished red and gold racing helmet, and gleaming boots, Turner crisscrossed the country entertaining crowds and setting records. He even had time to win the Thompson Trophy Air Race 3 times, a feat no other pilot ever approached.
I have maintained ever since that I've been flying that there's only one reason for flying, and that is speed. It's 1910 Curtis, 49 miles an hour. 1910 White, 61 miles an hour. 1911 Wyman, 78 miles an hour. 19 and 20, Moseley, 156 miles an hour. Maughan, in 19 and 22, 206 miles an hour. And 19 and 25, Doolittle, 232 miles an hour.
Bessie Coleman grew up in the Texas cotton fields before moving to Chicago to train as a beautician. When she decided to become a flyer, she was refused training in the American schools because of her color, so she headed for France in 1920. A year later, she returned to the U.S. with an international pilot's license and a thirst for adventure. Queen Bess became one of the most famous barnstormers. Skilled and daring, she awed crowds across the continent. Her ambition was to raise enough money to open a flying school for African Americans. She never fulfilled that dream. In 1926, while practicing for a show in Jacksonville, Florida, her plane went into a tailspin and she was thrown to her death. Although some of the more reckless civilian flyers occasionally gave aviation a black eye, most of them helped America lead the world into the air age. Wherever there was business enough, the gypsy flyer settled down. He bought a bigger plane, rented a larger cow pasture, and often gave free rides, especially to the ladies, rides with every modern convenience. Eventually, there grew up private inner-city taxi services, which flew millions of miles. These were the direct ancestors of today's big commercial airlines. Despite budget setbacks, the United States Air Service continued to make headlines. In May 1919, 3 Curtiss flying boats set out for Newfoundland to cross the Atlantic. 19 hours later, one of the aircraft made it to Lisbon, Portugal. On June 1919, 2 British airmen became the first to cross the Atlantic non-stop in 16 hours. The age of aviation record setters had begun. In May 1923, to complete the first non-stop coast-to-coast flight, the Air Service modified a giant commercial transport with special wing tanks. This was the 3rd attempt by the pilots, Lieutenants John McCready and Oakley Kelly, in the same plane. With 780 gallons on board, the tensest moment was the takeoff. It was far from certain that the fully loaded 10,000-pound monoplane would clear the Curtiss hangar at the end of the runway. Straining for every RPM it could muster, the Fokker T-2 climbed into the spring sky. Throughout the 2,150-mile flight, the pilots took turns at the controls. At an average speed of 94 miles an hour, less than 27 hours later, McCready and Kelly arrived over Rockwell Field, San Diego. After spanning the continent, the huge plane touched down to a thunderous welcome from the waiting crowd. We have just witnessed a page in history being turned. A dream come true, was how one reporter described the event. Coast-to-coast air travel was now a reality. One aspect of aircraft performance that especially fascinated the public in the 1920s and 1930s was the need for speed. At the RIMS Air Meet in 1909, the top speed of any aircraft had been 48 miles per hour. One of the greatest speed record holders of his day was Jimmy Doolittle. More famous today for his World War II raid on Japan, during the 20s and 30s, he was the king of speed at one time, holding both the seaplane and the land plane speed records. Doolittle signed up for aviator training when he joined the Army in 1917. Ironically, he was so good in the air that he never saw combat, being assigned to stay stateside to train others. After the war, he became a test pilot, and in 1922, he was the first man to cross the United States in under 24 hours.
In 19 1922, I flew from Pablo Beach, Florida, near Jacksonville, to San Diego, California, a distance of about 2,200 miles in 22 hours and 20 minutes. In 1931, I flew from Los Angeles, California to New York in 11 hours and 15 minutes. That first flight was the first time that the continent had ever been crossed in less than one day. Second flight was the first time it had ever been crossed in less than half a day.
In spite of all the time he spent in the air, Doolittle also found time to expand his knowledge of the aircraft he was testing, and in 1929, he earned one of the first doctorates in aeronautics from MIT. He put that knowledge to good use when he became the first man to fly from takeoff to landing completely blind on instruments alone.
I made the first blind flight, the first completely blind flight, taking off under a hood, flying a prescribed course, and landing back under the hood without ever having seen out of the airplane. This doesn't sound very important now, but out of that came two instruments, the artificial horizon, the directional gyro, that are today standard equipment on every commercial airplane and every combat military airplane.
The annual Schneider Trophy Seaplane Race became the focus of international revelers. Seaplanes were the fastest aircraft of the time, largely because they enjoyed an unlimited runway for takeoff and landing. In 1925, during the Schneider race at Baltimore, Lieutenant Jimmy Doolittle won the competition by setting a record of 232 miles per hour in a Curtiss R-3C, the last biplane to win that race. The remarkable Doolittle also set new records while claiming the Bendix Trophy in 1931 and the Thompson Trophy in 1932.
Crowd watching a real show today, starting with Jimmy Doolittle, the human bullet.
During the 1932 Thompson Trophy race, Doolittle flew one of the strangest aircraft ever to fly, the GB. This plane was little more than an engine with wings attached and was the most dangerous aircraft ever built, but it was fast. The GB Model R1, piloted by Doolittle, reached a top speed of 252.7 miles per hour and in a straight line could reach 300 miles per hour.
These record flights have a very real meaning. Competition has perhaps always been the greatest stimulus to improvement. And out of this competition came improvements that were improvements in the performance of aircraft and the safety of aircraft, and those improvements were immediately applicable to the military and indirectly applicable to commercial aviation.
The races were more than just shows for the crowd. These light, streamlined metal monoplanes showed the way for the fighter planes of World War II. Howard Hughes approached aviation the same way he did the rest of his life, serious, scientific, and with perfection. Sole heir to a Texas tycoon, Hughes grew up pampered and sheltered. At the age of 18, he inherited $17 million. Hughes moved to Los Angeles, where he pursued his interest in golf, filmmaking, and aviation. Hughes hired a team of the best designers and told them he wanted the fastest plane in the world. 2 years and $120,000 later, he had the Silver Bullet. With this plane, he set a new land plane speed record and a transcontinental record of 7 hours and 30 minutes. He retired the H-1 after a total of only 40 hours flying time. He next flew his Lockheed Lodestar around the world, flying 14,824 miles in 19 hours and 17 minutes and earning the Collier Trophy and demonstrating the value of organization and planning in long-range aircraft operations and paving the way for transcontinental air travel. Amelia Earhart may not have been the best woman flyer of her time, but she unquestionably was the most famous.
During the 1930s, some very interesting and famous pilots came by to evaluate our Electra because of its very, very high performance characteristics, and especially its single engine performance and its long range. Amelia Earhart was another one of those famous and wonderful persons that we got so well acquainted with, because when Amelia came to acquire her first Little Red Vega, as she called it, she put on a pair of Lockheed coveralls and went out in the shop and worked next to the woodworkers and the cabinet makers and then the final assembly, and went out on the flight line as part of the crew, and was a most gracious lady and a most appreciative lady, because she knew when she flew her airplane, almost every nut and bolt of any importance as it was assembled. Her confidence factor was improved immensely by the fact that she was a part of the building of her Little Red Vega. And naturally, we were so proud of her because she flew the Atlantic alone and was quickly named Lady Lindy.
In May of 1932, she was the first woman to cross the Atlantic solo. In July 1932, she became the first woman to cross the United States solo and the first person to fly from Hawaii to California in January 1935. She set a speed record for flying from Burbank, California to Mexico City in April 1935. In spite of her accomplishments, one record loomed. Although Wiley Post had already circumnavigated the globe, he had done so at the northern latitudes, and no one yet had circled the Earth at or near the equator. Earhart confided to a friend, "I have a feeling that there is just about one more good trip in me." The danger of flying such a distance mostly over water discouraged others, but her Lockheed Electra was well equipped for the challenge, and she would have Fred Noonan, Pan Am's chief navigator, at her side.
Later on, in years to come, we had another great experience with Amelia when she came out to personally become involved, just as she did on the Vega with her Model 10E Electra. That it was very specially built for her because she was going to carry approximately 1,100 gallons of fuel. She was going to have special navigation equipment. And in the process of building her airplane, once again, she put on coveralls and became especially involved in what we called our QEC, our power plant installations. In fact, I can recall her help plumbing and the engine installation, because she wanted to know firsthand how and where the fuel, the electrical power, everything came from in the power of the airplane, knowing full well that with two engines, she'd need them both with the heavy load takeoff that she was about to make on the round-the-world flight. In other words, once again, Amelia became part of our crew, part of us, in the process of building an airplane. Another demonstration of a great pioneer and a wonderful lady.
Earhart took her role model status seriously. She had begun teaching part-time at Purdue University, where she hoped to encourage women to pursue their dreams as she had done. On July 2nd, 1937, Earhart and Noonan began the last leg of their round-the-world flight, heading from New Guinea to tiny Howland Island, 2,500 miles away. Before and after they were due to arrive, Earhart sent several radio messages indicating they could not find Howland. Then, all contact was lost. The U.S. Navy swept the area for 16 days in the largest rescue mission ever mounted, but to no avail. No trace was ever found of Amelia Earhart or her Lockheed Electra. Before the flight, she was asked about the danger. She was quick to respond, "When I go, I'd like best to go in my plane, quickly." She got her wish. He was 25, but looked years younger, and at a time when the great names of the air were vying for the next big record, he was unknown. Nevertheless, Charles Lindbergh aimed to be the first to fly the Atlantic solo. In 1927, Lindbergh was not the only one trying to complete the journey. Several of the biggest names in aviation were preparing for the trip, with powerful multi-engine planes built by the top manufacturers. When he showed up in New York with a single-engine plane built by the tiny Ryan Company in San Diego, newspapers dubbed him the Flying Fool. By this time, 4 pilots had died, 3 had suffered injuries, and 2 were missing trying to cross the forbidding Atlantic. Lindbergh's plan was simple. To eliminate weight, Lindbergh sacrificed radio, sextant, lights, fuel gauges, and parachute. His entire provisions for the trip were 5 sandwiches and 2 canteens of water. The Spirit of St. Louis took off from New York on a rainy morning in May. The plane was so loaded with fuel that it cleared the telephone lines at the end of the runway by a mere 20 feet. Most who were present that day thought they would never see the former airmail pilot again. By the time he crossed the coast of Newfoundland, he had already been in the air for 11 hours and was racked by fatigue. The 15-hour crossing of the ocean would test both his flying skills and endurance to the limit. By the morning of May 21st, Lindbergh was hallucinating and creating images of land in the fog banks, but the first sight of a fishing boat and jagged coastline told him that he had made it across the Atlantic. The last 600 miles was routine. As the lone American Eagle landed at Le Bourget Field in Paris, tens of thousands of screaming Parisians broke into a riotous welcome. The boyish pilot was now the most famous man in the world. When some looked to the sky for adventure, others began to see dollar signs in the clouds. Not long after the end of the Great War, fledgling airline companies began to appear in Western Europe, transporting passengers in converted bombers. In the United States, carrying the mail was more profitable than passengers because of the government subsidies. A 150-pound passenger flying 1,000 miles would have had to pay a prohibitive $450 for the space to be worth it to the airlines. Early passengers even had to agree that the company could dump them if the airline came up with a mail bag to take their place. But still, people wanted to fly, and did in spite of cost, noise, and dangerous airplanes. When in 1931 a Fokker trimotor crashed in Kansas, killing Notre Dame football coach Newt Rockne and 6 other passengers, federal inspectors found that the plane came apart in midair, evidently from rot inside the huge wooden wing. The plane that cost Rockne his life belonged to an up-and-coming young company, Transcontinental and World Air, TWA. The airline quickly switched to the safer all-metal Ford trimotor, but it was slow and clumsy. In 1932, TWA asked manufacturers to come up with a truly modern airliner that could fly faster and farther and be more comfortable. In Santa Monica, California, Donald Douglas set his engineers to work on a design. Within 10 days, they had drawn up plans that would exceed TWA's specifications. The 12-seat DC-1 offered innovations such as cabin heaters, soundproofing, and dual controls for pilot and co-pilots. The wings were so strong they could handle the stress of a steamroller driving over them. By the time Douglas completed the DC-3 with seating for 21, passenger hauling became profitable. Efforts to improve the image of flying included increasing passenger comfort. One notable innovation came in 1930 at the initiative of a young nurse from Iowa, Ellen Church. Enthusiastic about flying, she persuaded Boeing Air Transport to hire her and 7 other nurses as stewardesses. At that point, air crews were all men, as were most passengers. Church argued that the presence of women on the aircraft would encourage passengers to regard flying as safe, while a trained nurse was just what a man needed when faced with the rigors of a long journey. The stewardess served chicken salad and coffee on elegant china plates, cups, and saucers. As the airspeed indicator and the altimeter mounted on the front cabin informed the passengers of their progress, the stewardess pointed out landmarks along the route. Unable to fly above the weather, airplanes frequently gave their passengers a bumpy ride. One of the stewardess's prime tasks was to care for people emptying their stomachs into the burp cups placed under every seat. The priority of early passenger flights was such that if a pilot thought his plane was overweight on takeoff, the first thing he would dump was the stewardess. He would then take off, leaving the passengers to their own resources, and in the process, offering the first self-service flight. It seemed only natural that Pan American Airways would name its planes after the clipper sailing ships that opened the trade routes to China. They were flying boats equipped with pontoons to land on water and were unlike anything that came before them. Pan Am began in 1927 as a small coastal airline flying the mail 90 miles from Key West to Havana. As the airline expanded, Pan Am commissioned the first large, luxurious flying boat clipper with room for 50 passengers. But as Pan Am looked to open routes to the Orient, they commissioned an even larger plane with the range that could fly the Pacific.
I remember very well one evening when Lindbergh and I were sitting in a small restaurant in Cuba, which we reached at the end of a Caribbean flight, and using the menu for paper, we made sketches of a transatlantic clipper. That was back in 31. A few years later, the transatlantic clippers have been produced, created, proved success, and as at present we know that transoceanic flying is perfect routine, perfectly self-evident part of our modern life.
In 1936, Pan Am began passenger service between San Francisco and Manila. Along the 5-day, 8,000-mile route, the China clippers refueled and resupplied at bases on Midway, Guam, and Wake Island. With luxury berths and full meal service, commercial air travel finally became a pleasure. The first aircraft to provide passenger service across the Atlantic was the Zeppelin. The Graf Zeppelin began service between Germany and Brazil in 1931. A marvel of safety and comfort, it made 590 flights and carried 13,000 passengers. The Graf Zeppelin proved so successful that in 1936, Germany introduced an even more ambitious version, the Hindenburg. The Hindenburg set a standard for luxurious travel that would rival the best ocean liner of the day. The Hindenburg boasted 25 double-berth private cabins and a 50-foot-long dining room, as well as a lounge with a grand piano and bar. All it lacked was the helium that the designers had specified should fill the gas cells. Because the only supplier, the U.S., refused to export helium, the Hindenburg made do with highly flammable hydrogen. On May 6, 1937, the Hindenburg was completing a very routine flight and was preparing to land at Lakehurst, New Jersey. As it hovered about 75 feet above the ground, a spark, either from static or natural electrical discharge, suddenly ignited leaking hydrogen in the tail section. Flames consumed the craft in just 32 seconds. Miraculously, 61 of the 97 persons on board survived. But the Hindenburg would be the last in a long line of disasters that had plagued the lighter-than-air community. The age of the airship died in the twisted wreckage in the Garden State.
Well, I'm going to tell you something, and you'll find hard to believe, and I'll put my hand on the Bible if you want me to. I dreamt, prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, one night I saw ships turning over, I saw guys diving over the side, and I saw smoke. Now you say, well, what brought that on? We were having air raid drills on Sunday. We were having them Sunday night instead of Sunday morning. Me thinking about those possibilities, I attributed that dream to that particular incident. But I did have a dream, and I will put my hand on a Bible. I will take a polygraph test if you ask me to convince you that I'm telling you the truth. But I dreamt what happened in Pearl Harbor prior to the time that it happened.
In April 1940, Roosevelt had ordered the United States Pacific Fleet to Pearl Harbor. This was the perfect location for the American forces in the Pacific, halfway between the United States West Coast and the Japanese military bases in the Marshall Islands. To the Japanese, this fleet posed a formidable threat to their ambitions in the Pacific. To combat this threat, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese fleet, devised a plan that was worthy of his poker player reputation. To open the war, he ordered 3 major attacks and several minor ones on American and British forces in the Pacific. The first, by a number of hours, was Pearl Harbor. The objective was to cripple the only force in the Pacific that could interfere with the other 2 attacks on the Philippines and Malaya. Surprise was essential in the Pearl Harbor attack. This was so not just because the attack itself was unexpected, putting the defender at a disadvantage, but also attacking a major naval base with carrier aircraft in broad daylight had never been done before, and no one was sure how successful it would be. On paper, it appeared it would work. Colonel Billy Mitchell, father of the American Air Corps, proved that. During his fight with the U.S. Navy, he persuaded the Army to allow him to demonstrate the capabilities of air power against naval targets. He was given the captured German capital ship, the Ostfriesland, and told to try to sink this unsinkable ship. Mitchell's squadron was successful at destroying the Ostfriesland and several other ships in later tests. But by proving that surface fleets were obsolete, he also sank his own career. The British had also proven this point rather successfully in a nighttime air raid on the Italian fleet in Taranto Harbor on November 11th and 12th, 1940. A raid that crippled Axis naval power in the Mediterranean Sea. The experienced and history-savvy officers of the Japanese fleet knew that the first time anything is tried, particularly something risky, the unexpected can be expected. Nagumo's force would include 6 heavy aircraft carriers, carrying 300 planes, accompanied by 24 supporting vessels and a fleet of submarines. In the spring of 1941, Admiral Yamamoto began mapping out his Pearl attack plan and showing it to other Japanese officials. The basic concept was to injure American military power in the Pacific to such an extent that Japan would be able to overrun a vast territory. Then the United States would ultimately decide on a negotiated peace rather than a protracted war. Japan could not grab this territory in the Pacific if a large enemy fleet was in the same waters at the same time. America had the only other large fleet, and most of it was based at Pearl Harbor. Cripple that fleet, and Japan could take whatever it wanted in the Pacific.
They called it the paradise of the Pacific, but it really wasn't. There wasn't a whole lot to do for servicemen there. They had boxing teams on the ship, and we had rowing, where we'd take rowing whaleboats out and have competition with the fleet. And basketball, and football, and baseball. But Liberty and Honolulu wasn't too good. I mean, there just wasn't a whole lot to do. I couldn't even go in and get a beer because I was too young. Couldn't buy no beer. Actually, you couldn't go to Waikiki Beach in uniform. So a lot of guys had locker over at the YMCA where they changed into dungaree pants and those Hawaiian shirts, and then you could go out there, but you couldn't go out there in uniform. And a lot of movie stars were out there, but I didn't go out there too much. Once, a couple of times.
The Pearl Harbor Strike Force, 6 carriers with 300 aircraft, 2 fast battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, 9 destroyers, and 3 submarines, supported by 8 tankers and supply ships, was concentrated in great secrecy at a secure anchorage in the Kuril Islands north of Japan. As part of the undertaking, another group of submarines was assigned to ferry 2-man midget subs tasked with penetrating Pearl Harbor from the sea at the time the airmen attacked. The primary targets of the attack were to be the American aircraft carriers. All U.S. aircraft were to be destroyed to prevent aerial opposition. A strong fighter element would be included in the attack for air cover for the fleet. The attack force would be equipped to refuel the attack aircraft at sea. The attack would be most effective if it could be carried out in daylight. Yamamoto preferred sunrise. There was opposition to Yamamoto's plan among Japan's Navy General Staff, but it was soon overcome, and the green light was given to proceed with preparations for the attack. All of the necessary training was given to troops, and all of the fighters and submarines were prepared. Although American and Allied intelligence services were aware that war was imminent, the much less secretive concentration of Japanese forces for an offensive southward into the southern resources area, Malaya, the East Indies, the Philippines, and so on, attracted their attention. War warnings to Pacific Theater commanders only confirmed their expectations that something would happen in that quarter. In the fall of 1941, the naval and air base at Pearl Harbor and the installations on Oahu represented the greatest concentration of American military power in the world. This force was under the command of Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, an officer with a stainless career who was given the command unexpectedly when his predecessor, Admiral James O. Richardson, had incurred the wrath of President Roosevelt. In normal circumstances, the island was the home to 9 or 10 battleships, 3 carriers with over 259 aircraft, a score or more of cruisers, and dozens of odd destroyers, submarines, and support ships, plus about 500 land-based aircraft and 2 understrength infantry divisions. General Walter Short, Army commander in Hawaii, dismissed the possibility of a carrier air raid on the place, despite the fact that the Navy had for years practiced such a bold stroke against the Panama Canal, San Diego, and Pearl Harbor itself. These practice raids had demonstrated that such operations were not at all difficult. Despite that, Short's principal concern seems to have been the threat of sabotage by members of Hawaii's large resident Japanese and Japanese-American population. On November 26, 1941, the strike force sailed under the command of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. Maintaining total radio silence, the strike force took a route through the North Pacific which had proven wholly devoid of shipping under normal circumstances. They sailed on, waiting for the coded order to launch the strike. Climb Mount Niitaka.